Into dark timber. I stood on the back deck of my new modest home in rural Utah, the early spring sun beginning to set. The scent of pine mingled with the earthy tones of sagebrush and juniper. I sipped from a mug of coffee, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the burn of unfinished emails in my gut. My name is Grayson, and my wife Nyasha and I had recently located back to Utah from Tennessee, after I burned out from working the most demanding 2 years of my professional career as a controller of a large for-profit health system, which included a 350-bed hospital, as well as 2 separate facilities for adult and adolescent psychiatric care in Nashville. The new controller job at the rural hospital in Utah wasn't glamorous. No fancy glass offices, no catered board meetings, no 60-hour weeks scrambling to impress people who didn't know my name, or who could care less to learn it. But it was steady, predictable, and in its simplicity, it gave me something I hadn't had in years: space. The backdrop of the Wasatch Mountains behind our house was stunning, and I couldn't shake the feeling as if they were calling me to find what secrets they might be holding them from afar. I had always had an interest in the outdoors, but my previous career pursuits had never allowed the time needed to pursue the opportunity much. "I think I want to try hunting," I told Nyasha one evening, out of nowhere. She looked up from her book. "Hunting?" "Yeah. I've always wanted to try it. Archery hunting, specifically. Seems quiet. Now that I finally have a little more time on my hands, I would love to try something other than scrolling through content on my phone and playing video games in my spare time." The next weekend, I wandered into a local outdoor supply store. The clerk, a weathered man with sun-scarred cheeks and a flannel shirt older than my marriage, smiled when I asked about beginner bows. "You ever shot before?" the man asked. "Nope. You scared of looking stupid?" "Not anymore." That earned a chuckle. Within a week, I had a basic recurve bow, some arrows, and a block target propped up against a foam target in the backyard. My first few shots were pitiful, wild and hopeless, thudding into dirt or skipping off into the brush. But every evening after work, I stood outside and shot. 10 arrows, 20, 50. It wasn't about getting good, not really. It was about stillness. Breath in, breath out. Draw, release. The world slowed down in those moments, and something ancient stirred inside me, an instinct long buried under spreadsheets and work meetings. Within 2 months of consistent practice, I went from being a complete amateur to feeling much more confident at further distances. One Saturday morning, I was in the backyard again shooting at my foam target. Thunk, thunk, thunk. 3 arrows buried deep, tight grouping. Not perfect, but satisfying. I was knocking my 4th arrow when a voice cut through the unseasonable warm spring haze. "Your grouping at 60 yards isn't too bad," came a low, graveled voice. "Do you do much bow hunting?" I flinched slightly and turned my head. Peeking over the aged fence dividing their yards was a man in his late 40s with a square jaw, deep-set eyes, and a scar across his right temple. Grady Diehl. I remembered the name from the mailbox next door. I hadn't met him yet, but the man clearly knew how to observe without being seen. No," I said, lowering the bow. "Never hunted anything, actually. Just getting into archery." Grady grinned slightly, more with his eyes than his mouth. "Well, you're starting in the right place. Most wannabe hunters can't hit the broadside of a barn at that distance." I chuckled nervously. Figured if I ever wanted to try hunting, I should probably be able to hit what I'm aiming at. "Fair logic," Grady replied. "Hitting's one thing, drawing blood's another." There was a silence between us, thick and buzzing with cicada hums. Grady's eyes stayed on the target, evaluating. "You planning on taking it any further?" Grady asked after a beat. I shrugged. "Maybe. I don't know the first thing about hunting. I figured this was step 1. Grady tilted his head, considering. Then, with deliberate slowness, he said, Step 2 would be learning what it means to kill something with a string and stick. The patience, the proximity, the way you feel the animal's last breath echo in your chest. It's not like pulling a trigger from 100 yards away. I said nothing. The words hung heavy. There was something in Grady's tone, not admiration, not revulsion, just truth, bald and unadorned. Grady seemed to study me for another second, then nodded once. "I go out sometimes," he said in a suspiciously humble tone. "If you're serious about getting started, maybe I'll show you the ropes." I blinked. "Really?" Grady smiled thinly, the scar pulling slightly. "Sure, if you don't mind getting your hands dirty. If you have a moment, swing by the house. I want to show you something." Then he vanished behind the fence. I stood there for a moment, the bow still in my hand, the wind slightly catching the fletching of the arrow I hadn't yet loosed. The target at the end of the yard seemed farther now, not in distance, but in purpose. After releasing a few more arrows into the foam target, I put my bow away and made my way over to Grady's house. "Glad you could make it," Grady said, ushering me inside. The interior smelled of pine wood and tobacco. Mounted along the walls were a series of deer, 8 points, 10 points, one impressive 12-point buck, its glassy eyes forever fixed in wary surprise. Guns were neatly racked along one wall. A large flat-screen TV displayed paused footage of an elk herd meandering across a snowy valley. "Been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle," Grady said as he handed me a beer. "Started in East Texas, whitetails mostly. Moved up here for work late last winter, software job. But the land up here, man." He trailed off, looking past the wall like he could see the wilderness beyond it. "It's like every hill's hiding a story." He led me to the back room where his hunting gear was organized with military precision. Trail cams, compound bows, binoculars, scent blockers, packs, tents, field dressing kits, and SD cards meticulously labeled by date and location. On a second TV, Grady queued up clips: black bears flipping over rocks, a bobcat stalking through sagebrush, even a mountain lion sniffing curiously at a tree-mounted camera. "Been recording for years," Grady said, eyes gleaming. "I've got hours of footage. Not just the kill shots, behavior, patterns, migrations, everything. But it's hard going solo. You get one angle, maybe two if you're lucky. Editing, tracking, filming. Too much for one man." He turned to me, face suddenly serious. "That's why I wanted you to come over. I'm not just hunting anymore. I'm building something. A channel, a brand. I want footage clean enough to pitch to something like the Outdoor Channel, or even Netflix if I play it right." I leaned forward, feeling my own pulse quicken. "And you want a partner?" "I want someone hungry. Someone who doesn't just want to pull the trigger but wants to learn. Someone who can spot, film, maybe even track. I'll teach you everything I know. You in?" I didn't hesitate. "Hell yes, I'm in." We clinked beer bottles, the deer mounts silently watching, as the screen flickered with another frame of wild, untamed country, waiting for us. Over the next few weeks, Grady guided me through every step needed for the Utah open archery elk hunt, registering for courses, buying permits, studying archery safety. By mid-May, I had my hunting license, replaced my recurve bow with a reliable compound bow, and had a head full of questions about hunting tactics and how to understand and predict elk behavior. Grady answered them all with the steady patience of a mentor, weaving lessons into early dawn hikes and late-night maps sprawled on the tailgate of his truck during our weekend scouting excursions leading up to opening day. It was our third weekend scouting trip in the high Uintas. Grady and I had both taken off work that Friday to begin the 3-hour hike deep into our chosen hunting grounds, each with a silent urgency tugging at us. The past 2 trips had been a wash. Long days glassing the timber, boots soaked from glacier runoff trails, and the heavy silence of elk absence weighing on our shoulders. Still, we kept coming back, That cow and calf we caught on one of Grady's many trail cameras last week were enough to keep the hope of finding a target bull elk alive, barely flickering, but alive. By the time we reached the cliff face, our usual vantage point, the sun was already bleeding orange along the ridges. Grady passed me the heavier pair of binoculars, the Zeiss ones, and I settled in next to him on a worn slab of granite, its surface cold against my hunting pants. The distant timberline below us was an almost black wall, dense and unmoving. "Look for glints," Grady murmured, "that brown-gold shimmer. The way the last light hits their fur." I nodded. I'd heard it enough to recite it in my sleep. We scanned in silence, the kind that settles only between people who have done this together a while. Each minute that passed pressed down a little heavier. The dusk, the third weekend, the hunger for a sign. I was beginning to accept another fruitless day when something flashed in my left eyepiece. Not a shimmer exactly, more like movement. I froze, heart thudding. It was there. Half hidden in a dense cluster of the tall pines, something tall had moved. I adjusted the focus slowly, afraid even a breath would disrupt whatever fragile spell had been cast. My pulse leapt. No, soared. As I hastily adjusted the focus, the shape sharpened, and something was off. At first glance, it was elk-like, brown hide, large frame. But then came the rest. Its posture wasn't rearing like a bull, it was upright, standing, naturally. Its limbs, arms maybe, hung too long, swaying slightly at its sides. And the head, narrow, tall, all wrong. Antlers sprouted from the crown, but they weren't tines. They were twisted, like gnarled branches. The way it moved sent a chill through me, not skittish or alert like prey. It seemed to move with confidence, the kind that doesn't bother looking for threats. The movement seemed almost human-like. My mouth dried. The binoculars trembled slightly against my brow. "Grady," I whispered unnecessarily. "Look, north slope, just left of the furthest timberline, about 100 feet in." He swung his binos in the direction, adjusting furiously. I kept my eyes locked on the figure, which now had taken a step, a stride, back into the timber. Its motion fluid, disturbingly natural yet so unnatural at the same time. "I don't see it," Grady said. "It's," I began, then stopped. It was gone. The timber was still again. No movement, no trace. Grady scanned for a while longer, then gave me a sidelong glance. "What did you see?" I paused. My instincts warred with each other. The part of me that wanted to share every hair-raising detail, and the other that knew how it would sound. Crazy. Desperate. Maybe even a little weak. "I'm not sure," I said finally. Grady didn't push it. He went back to scanning the slope, his eyes calm and steady. But I stayed quiet after that. Didn't mention the way its movement seemed so wrong. Not like an animal, but reassembling something more like a man. Didn't talk about how the air had felt colder for just a second, how every instinct in my body had screamed at me to look away. I told myself it was nothing, just the mind playing tricks. A trick of light, a tired brain from the thin mountain air. But when we packed up and made our way back down to camp, I couldn't stop glancing behind me. The timber was too quiet, too dense, too still, and far too dark. The last light of the day clung to the ridges above us, casting long shadows across the canyon. Grady and I wrapped up our glassing session on the cliff face, the silence between us filled with the kind of quiet that only the backcountry can offer. We made the short hike back to camp, boots crunching on loose shale, and by the time we got the fire going, dusk had folded into full night. The air turned sharp and cold despite the early summer season. The Uintas were unpredictable in that way. We wrapped our tinfoil dinners in layers of meat, onion, and potato. Simple, hearty food that hits different out here. While the fire crackled and our dinners cooked, Grady got quiet for a moment and rubbed his chest while breathing shallowly. He stared into the flames, then finally spoke. "I've got a pretty serious heart condition," he said. Had it since I was a kid. I turned to him, caught off guard. He went on, voice steady. It hadn't slowed him much when he was younger, he said, but lately the signs were harder to ignore. The fatigue, the tightness in his chest that lingered longer each time. A dull reminder that time doesn't stop for anyone. Part of the reason he'd been looking for a hunting partner, he told me, wasn't just for the company. It was because he knew the risks. Heading deep into the wilderness, miles from any road or signal, with a heart that might quit on him. That wasn't a gamble he wanted to take alone anymore. I've done this solo a long time, he said, but I ain't dumb. If something happens out here, I'd rather not be by myself when it does. I always carry a satellite phone, and folks back home know my camp coordinates. There was no shame in his tone, just plain honesty. A man who loved the wild but had learned where his limits lived. I nodded. I'm glad to be here with you, I said, and I meant it. Out there, under the stars and surrounded by nothing but wilderness, trust means more than words. It's in the shared silence, the unspoken agreement that when it comes down to it, you've got each other's back. We wrapped up dinner and cracked open a few beers and discussed our tactics for the morning. Dawn was going to come quickly, and we didn't want to potentially miss any elk movement by sleeping in. At first light, we'll be glassing again, posted up on the ridgeline to catch any early movement through the valley, Grady said. After that, we'll hike to each of the trail cameras we set last week, hoping they've captured something during the night. We talked through the plan, check the footage, look for fresh tracks or rubs, then move toward the watering holes and likely feeding areas. It's all about reading the land, being patient, and letting the mountain tell its story. Tomorrow, we follow that story a little deeper. As I lay in my sleeping bag, my mind burned with the bizarre image I had captured earlier that evening. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light or heat distortion. There was no way I had actually seen the creature my imagination now replayed through the lens of my binoculars. Despite my anxiety over what I thought I had seen, the day's labor, the high elevation, and the rough hiking terrain had taken its toll, and I quickly drifted off in my sleeping bag. It was still deep night. My watch showed 3:33 a.m. I stayed nestled in my sleeping bag, the cold air biting at the tip of my nose, and just listened. The calls were distant, carried by the wind, rising and falling like some wild hymn of the high country. This was the first time I had ever experienced such a thing. The bugles made my heart skip a beat with excitement, but more than anything, I felt a deep sense of awe and privilege to be hearing them. I must have lain there for half an hour, heart calm, mind still. Eventually, sleep crept back in, and I drifted off again to the sound of wild voices in the dark. I blinked into the blue haze of dawn, still sleeping hard and dreamless, when I heard the soft tap-tap against the nylon wall of my tent. It was Grady. Elk were bugling last night, he said, voice low but eager. Sounded like a couple of bulls down in the timber pocket west of camp. That woke me fully. I sat up, rubbing the chill from my arms, and dressed as quickly as I could. The air smelled of cold pine and wood smoke, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a raven called, harsh and distant. We didn't waste time. I unzipped the tent, boots already on and ready to make the short hike to the cliffside. Grady was crouched near the fire pit with a pot of coffee beginning to come to a boil. Steam ghosted up from the tin pot and vanished into the pale blue morning. He looked up at me, his breath fogging in the light. We've got maybe 30 minutes before first light hits the basin, he said, voice low. We poured the freshly brewed coffee into our thermoses and made our way to the cliffside glassing spot. The first 3 hours of morning were spent glassing the timberline. Grady had spotted a mule deer buck with 3 does trailing behind, but no elk had shown themselves. Still, the bugling we'd heard the night before echoed in our memory, keeping our hopes alive. I stayed laser-focused on the tree line, searching for the faintest sign of movement. Hoof, antler, shadow. But in the quieter corners of my mind, something else stirred. Would I recognize that same creature again, if it appeared? Had I even truly seen it the first time? Grady and I made our way back to camp to review the footage from the 6 trail cameras we'd set up across the ridgeline, each one positioned with intent. Watering holes, feeding grounds, and a few tight pinch points where game trails weaved through thick timber like braided thread. The first camera was a bust, just wind-tossed limbs, a curious squirrel or two, and the occasional shadow play of moving light. I could feel Grady's subtle shift in posture, the way his jaw set a little firmer. He didn't like wasting time, especially when it came to looking for sign. The second camera was stationed near the largest watering hole. As we scrolled through its footage, Grady leaned in closer. There, a brief glimpse, the broad backside of a cow elk, head dipped to hastily drink, then a partial frame of a calf, just on the edge of the lens. Likely the same ones the trail camera had caught earlier, probably. Nothing out of the ordinary, but it confirmed they were still frequenting the area. Still moving. Same pair, Grady muttered, that calf sticking tighter than I expected. The calf looked stressed, ears back, steps quick and unsteady. Even through the grainy footage, something in its body language prickled the back of my neck. It wasn't just tagging along, it was fleeing in the safest way it could. Grady paused the clip, scrubbing back and forth over those few seconds like he was trying to draw more meaning from the pixels than the lens ever intended to capture. Something pushed him, he said flatly, more to himself than to me. I glanced at him. You thinking a mountain lion? He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the frame where the calf's hindquarters disappeared out of view, as if waiting for a phantom to reappear. Maybe, but if it was, they'd be gone completely. That cow wouldn't bring her calf back here if she thought the danger was still close. He exhaled through his nose, slow and tight. Could be pressure from other hunters. We both knew the area hadn't seen any boot traffic yet other than our own, and wasn't likely to with how deep into the timber we had decided to scout and prepare to hunt. Archery season was still a week out, and even then, few folks, if any, ever ventured into this deep of the backcountry without good reason. The third camera recorded a 3-second clip, just long enough to unsettle me. Something moved at the edge of the frame. It looked like antlers, but something was off. The texture was wrong, almost organic but not bone, and the points curled in unnatural directions, like they were searching for something. "What the hell is that?" I asked Grady. He squinted at the screen. "Not sure," he muttered. "Might just be some branches blown into frame by the wind." I nodded slowly, pretending that made sense. But in the pit of my stomach, something didn't sit right. The day of scouting and reviewing trail camera footage had stretched into late afternoon. With the weekend winding down, the weight of Monday's obligations pressed heavier with each passing minute. We gathered the trail cameras and any gear we wouldn't need, or couldn't legally use, once opening day arrived the following weekend. Then, in quiet understanding, we began the slow hike back to the truck, each step a reminder that the freedom of the woods was giving way to the drudgery of the work week ahead. I got home late Sunday evening, worn out and craving nothing but sleep. Nyasha was waiting, her voice soft as she asked how the weekend scouting trip had gone. I told her about the elk, the way their bugles echoed through the canyons in the gray pre-dawn light. It was more than just a sound. It stirred something primal in me, something I hadn't felt before and didn't have the words to explain. But then, that image on the cliff came rushing back. My stomach clenched at the memory I thought I'd buried somewhere in the silence of the mountains. That impossible shape, still as stone in the evening light, like it had stepped out of a world where the rules of nature bent or broke completely. I hesitated. The urge to spill every strange detail to her welled up in me, sharp and sudden. But I swallowed it down, held it there. Nyasha had grown up in Zimbabwe, where people typically believed that strange things meant something, always. She had a way of listening too closely, of finding meaning in things I wasn't ready to understand myself. And I didn't want her worrying, not now, not with opening day so close. I was right on the edge of experiencing something I hadn't known I'd desired my whole life. I wasn't going to let anything, seen or unseen, get in the way. The Monday morning dread hit like a freight train. Tight deadlines loomed over Thursday, deadlines I had completely forgotten about during the weekend scouting trip. The contrast was jarring. I sat at my desk, but my mind was still in the high country, replaying the echoes of elk bugles in the dead of night. Deadlines didn't matter out there. Out there, time moved differently. All I could think about now was the rush, the possibility of drawing my bow on a bull, or maybe catching that perfect moment on video as Grady released his arrow. I spent an extra hour each day shooting at my foam target the week leading up to opening day, preparing for the moment I knew might come only once, all season, if I was lucky enough to get it at all. Thursday night arrived with a buzz of anticipation. I had barely wrapped up the final deliverables in time, just enough to silence the lingering anxiety from my old life and shift my focus to what truly mattered now. Opening day. That night, I went to bed excited, my body ready for rest, my mind already in the woods. But sleep wasn't gentle. I jolted awake at 3:33 a.m. My chest was heaving, my skin damp. I couldn't remember the dream exactly, only the sensation of sprinting through darkness, like I'd been chased by something I couldn't see. The kind of dream that feels more like a memory than imagination. Beside me, Nyasha stirred. She looked over, her voice low but edged with concern, though half asleep. "Are you okay?" I nodded automatically, but she didn't believe me. I didn't believe me either. My pulse was still hammering. Something was wrong. I searched my mind for details but found only fractured glimpses. A desperate run through rocky terrain, timber pressing in from all sides, deadfall snaring my feet like tripwires, each step a stumble with something closing distance quickly that I couldn't see, but could feel. I had only experienced a few night terrors in my lifetime, but this one was unlike anything before. I lay awake for 15 minutes or so, careful not to stir Nyasha. Eventually, sleep crept back in and took me under again. The morning came quickly. Both Grady and I had taken the day off from work. It was time to run through our gear one final time, checking packs, tuning bows, double-checking broadheads, batteries, boots, clothing layers, and everything in between. With the truck packed and confidence high, we headed back up into the mountains, returning to the hunting area where we'd spent the past 4 weeks scouting, hiking ridgelines, and poring over every minute of trail camera footage. About 30 minutes into the hike to the campsite, Grady raised his right hand, open palm, elbow bent square. I froze mid-stride, boots crunching softly in the brush. Ahead, just beyond a thinning wall of juniper, something moved, a flicker of shadow in the clearing. At the edge of a narrow stream stood a calf elk, small, emaciated. Its coat hung in patchy tufts over a scaffold of ribs. It drank with frantic urgency, head bobbing as it lapped like it hadn't tasted water in days. Grady leaned back toward me. "Grab the GoPro," he whispered, eyes locked on the animal. I slid the camera from my pack, flicked it on, and framed the shot over his shoulder as he crept forward. I followed, careful to match his silence, the lens trembling in my hands. He moved like a ghost through the forest, each step deliberate, as if the ground might crack open beneath him. Somehow, we closed the distance. The calf didn't notice, didn't care, just kept drinking. When Grady reached it, he extended a hand and touched its hindquarter. No flinch, no blink, just more frantic drinking. Up close, the truth was stark. The calf's eyes were glazed, deadened. Flies clung to its lips and nostrils, unmoving. It looked less like an animal and more like something left behind by life, dreaming on instinct, dying. Grady crouched beside it. Neither of us spoke. It didn't feel like wildlife footage anymore. It felt like a funeral we'd wandered into by mistake. When the calf finally raised its head, it looked through us, past us. Its gaze hit something in my spine that hasn't let go since. Then it staggered into the brush, legs buckling with each step, and vanished. Grady stood slowly. "In all my years hunting," he said, voice low, "I've never seen anything like that. That calf either got lost from its cow, or it's sick. Chronic wasting disease, maybe." He exhaled. "Either way, it's not going to make it." We stood in silence, letting the moment settle. Awe and grief, helpless and hollow. Out here, mercy was an unknown concept. We watched the footage together in the soft warmth of morning. No commentary. Just two men staring into a little screen, lit by its pale glow. We watched it all, the calf, the brush, the stream, and it felt less like a wildlife clip and more like a message, meant for no one. After a few moments, we looked at each other and silently agreed. It was best to keep moving toward the campsite. The summer heat pressed down like a heavy hand, and the sun showed no mercy. Dust kicked up with each step, clinging to our boots and sweat-soaked clothes. Grady paused and leaned against the broad trunk of a shady pine, his movements slower than usual. He took a long pull from his canteen, then let his head rest back against the bark, eyes shut for a beat too long. I noticed the sweat pouring off him, more than the heat or the climb could explain. His shirt was pasted to his back, and his chest rose and fell in shallow heaves. "You all right?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, but the tightness in my throat gave me away. He nodded, though his voice came out thin and frayed as he placed his free hand over his chest. "Yeah," he said. "Just need a second, catch my breath." But there was a thinness in his voice, a tremble he couldn't quite hide. He wasn't fine, not really. After a few moments, he seemed to recover his strength well enough to continue the hike. We were closing a half-mile from camp when a foul stench drifted through the trees, thick and unmistakable. The smell of death. With each step, it grew stronger, heavier, until we saw it, about 40 yards off the trail. A large, brown shape slumped in the earth, half-sunken, like the forest was trying to swallow it. We approached cautiously, eyes scanning the ground, trying to read the story written in bent grass, churned mud, and the collapsed carcass. Up close, it was clear. A cow elk. Dead. Violently so. It looked like it never had a chance. Deep slashing wounds marred its flank and neck, clear signs of a large predator. But Grady looked disturbed, more than I'd expect even for something like this. He crouched beside it, brow furrowed, lips tight. "What are you seeing?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pointed. Whatever killed it hadn't fed. Only the afterswarm of forest scavengers, birds, maybe rodents, had come to pick at the edges. And then the tracks. Elk prints were easy to spot in the soft ground, but there were others, smaller elk tracks, pacing in circles around the carcass. Dozens of them, like something had lingered, restless or panicked. But no predator tracks. Nothing. No mountain lion prints. No bear impressions. No drag marks. No broken branches leading in or out. Nothing to explain what had delivered the fatal blow. Only that dead elk, and a silence that felt too complete. We took a few moments to film the carcass and the surrounding area, planning to review the footage later in case we'd missed something. The visceral scene before us made me question whether we'd brought the right gear, despite trusting Grady's decades of deep wilderness experience. We'd packed light, just the essentials for the hunt and enough to film what we needed. Our only real weapons were our bows, each of us having selected our most reliable 3 broadhead-tipped arrows. Up to now, this stretch of country had never struck us as especially dangerous. There were black bears, sure, but they usually kept their distance. Still, we'd brought a single can of bear spray, more out of habit than concern. Arriving back at camp, we checked over everything we'd left set up. The tents, sleeping bags, light bedrolls, even the few folding chairs we'd stashed inside. It was all exactly as we'd left it. Nothing appeared out of place. Grady double-checked his satellite phone to make sure that he was getting a reliable signal at camp. Once we'd re-established camp, I volunteered to gather firewood for the evening. Grady was tied up with the camera gear, checking batteries, swapping out cards, cleaning lenses, making sure everything still worked. I had to go farther than usual this time. We'd already picked over the nearby deadfall during the past few weeks of scouting, so I pushed deeper, just past the timberline, out of sight of the tents. That's when the forest changed. No birdsong, no wind threading the limbs, not even the lazy buzz of flies or the chatter of squirrels. Just that kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, only paused, held, as if something was waiting. I froze, a few pieces of wood tucked under my arm, and the skin on the back of my neck began to tighten. I couldn't see anything in the thick pines, but I felt it, something watching me. Not close, but not far, just beyond reach, just beyond reason. Something that didn't want to be found. I straightened up, scanning the trees. Nothing. Still, the feeling rooted itself deep in my chest. I stayed alert, gathering what deadfall I could without crouching too low, my eyes sweeping the timberline, my ears tuned for the faintest snap of a twig. And I listened, not just for sound, but for movement, for intention, for anything at all. As I arrived back at camp with the firewood in hand, the forest seemed to settle, returning to a familiar stillness. That strange feeling of dread eased with every step closer to the firelight, as if whatever had been watching had slipped back into dense concealment of the trees. "That should be plenty for the next day or two," Grady said, eyeing the bundle of thick, dry branches under my arms. I nodded but said nothing about the unease I'd felt out there. No need to tell Grady I'd nearly spooked myself over a torn-up elk carcass. I didn't want him thinking I was losing my nerve. We spent the rest of the afternoon in camp, resting sore legs and weighing the pros and cons of different feeding grounds and watering holes, quietly debating which spot might give us the best shot come first light. As the sun dipped low and spilled orange across the tree line, we struck a fire and boiled water for our MREs in silence. I sat with my knees drawn up, poking at a pouch of beef stew, my thoughts drifting. That thing I thought I saw last week, the delirious calf, the elk carcass, ripped apart but the meat untouched. My mind kept trying to draw lines between it all, lines it didn't want to believe in. They couldn't all be coincidence, could they? "Grady," I said, breaking the quiet, "what's the closest call you've ever had on your hunting trips?" He gave a slow, crooked grin. "Funny you should ask," he said, leaning forward, palms open to the fire. "It was a bear hunt in Idaho. 5, maybe 6 years ago. My older brother was with me. We were running dogs in some thick timber near the sawtooths, middle of nowhere. I remember hearing the dogs go off, but not the usual excited bark. This was different, panicked, choppy. Then," he paused. "Then everything went dead quiet. He stared into the flames like they were showing him something only he could see. And then the brush just exploded. Big brown bear, 350, maybe 400 pounds, came tearing straight at me. I didn't have time to think. My body just took over. I raised the shotgun, but it felt like I was underwater. Everything slowed down. He mimed the motion, hands ghosting through the air like he was reliving it. I squeezed off 3 slugs. Boom, boom, boom. My vision tunneled on that bear. I swear I saw each shell kick out of the chamber like beer cans, spinning in slow motion. That bear dropped 10 feet in front of me, skidded in the pine needles, didn't twitch. He gave a low, shaky laugh, just enough to cover the tremor in his voice. Closest I've ever come to needing new pants. I shook my head. I don't know what I would have done in that situation. Grady looked over with a wry smile. "Well, if we ever get this hunting channel off the ground, you might end up with a few stories of your own. We wrapped up dinner and retreated to our respective tents for the night. As I lay in my sleeping bag, my mind raced with the excitement, the very real possibility that come morning, I might draw down on an elk for the first time in my life. As sleep took hold, my dreams filled with the haunting cries of elk bugles and the hush of the deep forest. I awoke in the dead of night with the pressing urge to relieve myself. Blinking away the fog of sleep, I checked my watch, to see how much longer I had until the 4 a.m. alarm. 3:33 a.m. My brow furrowed. This was the third time I'd woken at that exact hour. I chalked it up to nerves, or maybe subconscious anticipation, making sure I didn't oversleep. After all, the coming morning was opening day. We had to reach our chosen watering hole before the woods stirred. Not only did we need to get settled in our makeshift blind, but we also had to position both cameras just right, covering every possible angle in case one of us got a clean shot. I quietly crept out of my tent, careful not to disturb the silence of the forest. Grady was still snoring a few yards away in his own tent, the sound muffled but steady. The full moon hung low, casting a silver wash across the timberline, just enough light to make out shapes and movement in the shadows that danced in the soft mountain breeze. With a pack of wet wipes in hand, I made my way into a small pocket of trees to relieve myself. The pine needles were damp underfoot, and the air was crisp with the scent of sap and soil. When I finished and stood up, tugging my belt snug, something caught my eye in the distance. A dark, towering presence that seemed to be standing up right on what appeared to be hind legs with unnaturally long arms and possibly crooked and twisting antlers on its massive head, seemed to be staring at me, but was difficult to completely discern with the backdrop of the obscuring tree branches. It was hard to really make out anything with the low visibility. The shadows wavered and shifted in the breeze, but the darkened image against the backdrop of the shadows of dark timber didn't move. Everything around it stirred. Needles, twigs, brush. But the figure seemed to stay perfectly still, watching with an unnatural intelligence. I froze. My chest felt like ice. I blinked hard, once, twice, but the figure didn't vanish. If anything, the longer I looked, the more the figure seemed to solidify against the darkness. I didn't move, not because I chose not to, but because something in me refused. A stillness rooted deeper than fear, the kind of stillness a rabbit knows when it's pinned beneath the gaze of a hawk. The wind stirred the branches. Just before they swayed shut, the face blinked. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe that was just my breath clouding the view. Then a gust pushed through the timber. The trees whispered, and the figure was gone as if it had never been there at all. I stood there another minute, maybe more, heart punching behind my ribs, trying to find it again in the brush. Nothing. Only the breeze. Only the faint sound of Grady's distant, labored snoring, steady as ever. I backed away slowly, wiping my hands down my pants, feeling suddenly small out there under the moon. Vulnerable. By the time I got back to my tent, the cold had settled in deeper. I crawled inside, zipped the flap, and lay there staring at the dark nylon ceiling, listening to every crack and sigh in the trees like they might spell something. And that figure burned into the dark behind my eyes. Morning was just an hour away, but I couldn't shake the image from the timberline. It haunted me, burned into the backs of my eyes every time I blinked. I kept going over it all. That first glimpse of something off on the cliff face, the delirious calf, staggering like it had been touched by fever. The elk carcass, clearly killed, yet bearing no sign of the predator that brought it down. The sensation of being watched while gathering firewood, hairs lifting on the back of my neck. And now, that figure, that thing, standing in the darkness, half formed in shadow, if truly there, then unmistakably watching me. There seemed to be a thread connecting these moments, something unseen, pulling tighter with each passing hour. I could feel it winding around me, even if I couldn't trace its full shape. But my rational mind clung to the edge, white-knuckled and stubborn. refusing to believe what my senses were screaming. Not yet. As I lay there, trying to string together logical explanations for everything I'd seen and felt, I heard Grady stirring, rustling in his tent, zippers and nylon whispering in the half-light. He was getting ready for the hike to the watering hole, just like we'd planned the day before. The anxiety that had kept me half awake began to shift, first to focus, then to resolve. Whatever shadows haunted these woods, I wasn't going to let them get in the way of what we came here to do. We skipped breakfast that morning, grabbing a few granola bars to tide us over. With bows slung and camera gear in hand, we began our quiet hike toward the watering hole. Only what was absolutely necessary was spoken, and even then, in barely a whisper. Grady moved without sound, but not with his usual grace. He was clearly struggling. The gear weighed heavier on him than it should have, and he was getting winded more quickly than I'd ever seen before. As we crested the rise that lay below the small pond, our eyes swept the timberline, careful not to send anything bolting back into the shadows. The pond sat cradled at the bottom of a steep, narrow valley on the north face, where the morning sunlight would continue to cast shadows late into the morning. Clear game trails climbed the staggering slope beyond, winding higher into the mountains. The timber choking those trails was dense, so dense you could barely see a yard past the first line of trunks. A cool breeze whispered down from the ridge, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the faint musk of damp earth. It flowed over the pond and spilled into the meadow behind us. Perfect wind, perfect setup. "Grady, you good?" I whispered. Yeah, he said, breath a little ragged, one hand resting on his chest. "Just a little winded. We should get in place. Elk will be moving now." I gave a quick nod as Grady slung his bow and camera gear, then slipped toward his position. Our plan was simple: set up about 80 yards apart, each tucked into a patch of brush with a clean view of the water. Grady took the east side. I claimed the west. Whoever had the closer shot would take it, no second guessing. Grady positioned his cameras close, one trained on the main trail, the other on the smaller path spidering toward the pond. I eased into my hide, every sound suddenly amplified: the breeze teasing dry grass, the soft crunching of my boots against foliage as I shifted my stance, the faint tick of my heartbeat in my ears. The valley seemed to hold its breath. We were in perfect position now, nothing left but to wait and watch. My eyes locked on the narrow trail spilling out from between the towering walls, ears straining for the faintest stir of movement. Every few moments, I stole a glance at Grady, scanning his distant body language for any sign he'd caught for something I hadn't. Out here, a single twitch of the eyes could mean everything. 15 minutes had passed since we first set up, each second taut with the possibility that I might finally draw down on an elk. But then, without warning, something shifted inside me. A sudden, crushing wave of dread slammed into my chest, so strong it nearly stole my breath. The forest no longer felt neutral. It felt aware, watching. I strained my hearing until it hurt, sifting the silence for anything out of place. It came, a single brittle snap. Not from the game trail ahead, but from somewhere behind me. 15 yards, maybe less. Moving as slowly as wind through pine needles, I turned. Every muscle locked tight, trying not to betray my presence. My eyes adjusted to the shadowed undergrowth, and then I saw it. The thing I'd glimpsed earlier now stood fully revealed. It didn't crouch, it didn't hide, it just looked at me. Its eyes, lifeless, glassy, black, unblinking, didn't simply meet mine. They pinned me. It was impossibly tall, 9 feet, maybe more. The shape was wrong, all wrong. A nightmare cross between a man and an elk, standing upright on hind legs. Long, narrow arms dangled past its knees, ending in black, clawed hands. Antlers grew straight from bone, gnarled tines glistening in the dim light. And I knew, this wasn't a thing that belonged to nature. This was a thing that wore it. I couldn't move. My breath caught. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then, it grinned. A hideous smile, too wide, stretching the length of its face, revealing long canine-shaped teeth. Its head tilted slightly to one side, like a curious predator deciding whether to strike. That broke the trance. I eased backward step by step toward Grady's position, clutching my bow so tight my knuckles ached. My heart pounded like a war drum, every breath shallow and stolen. When I reached the pond's edge, I forced the air into my lungs and found my voice. "Grady!" I yanked an arrow from my quiver and knocked it in one motion. The creature took a single step toward me. I turned and bolted toward Grady, desperate to reach his position. Deadfall tangled the ground around the pond, and my boot caught. I pitched forward, arms outstretched, trying to break the fall. The arrow had shaken loose from the string mid-sprint. My palms slammed down on it. It punched straight through my left hand. A molten spike of pain shot up my arm, iron hot, blinding. Blood surged, warm and slick, cascading down my wrist as I gasped. I staggered to my feet, wrenched the arrow free, and stumbled toward Grady, not realizing I had left my bow behind in my panic, shouting his name through the trees. No answer. When I found him, he was slumped over, breath hitching in shallow bursts, eyes rolling. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his heart finally beginning to fail. I grabbed his shoulders, shaking him, calling his name again. Nothing. His body was limp, unmoving. Panic clawed at my chest. I spun around, scanning the trees for any sign of the creature, but the woods were silent. Too silent. Blood still poured from my hand. I knew if I didn't stop it soon, I'd end up as helpless as Grady. I ripped my belt free and wrapped it around my wrist, pulling tight until the pain dulled to a throbbing pulse. My thoughts spiraled. Grady was dying. The thing was still out there. I had no idea which direction safety even was, but standing still felt like suicide. I remembered Grady had always kept his satellite phone close in case of emergencies. I searched his pockets and located phone. No signal. The timberline was too thick, causing an interruption. I made the choice to run back to camp to try and get an emergency message out. Branches whipped against my jacket as I pushed through the trees, glancing in every direction. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Then the forest opened up into a clearing. I stopped at the edge, heart hammering, scanning the open space. It seemed clear. I stepped forward. 20 yards in, I saw it before I could check for a clear phone signal. The creature stood at the far end of the clearing, motionless, upright, watching me. No attempt to hide. Its stillness was worse than motion. A wave of despair hit me so hard it nearly dropped me to my knees. I felt hollow, stripped of will. Was this how it would end? It watched me with what I could only describe as amusement. Malicious, patient, almost mocking. Then, through the haze of fear, a moment of clarity struck. I thought of every choice that had led me here. The years wasted behind screens and spreadsheets, the constant obligation, the safety that had felt like a cage. And now, the one time I'd reached for something real, something alive, it was all going to end like this. I thought of Grady, alone, dying, and of how quickly I'd run in an attempt to find help that would certainly come too late. Rage surged through the despair, hot and clean. The frustration burned away the fear. No, I was done running from my problems. I wasn't going to die crawling. I wasn't going to abandon him. If this was the end, I was going to meet it head on. I turned and sprinted back toward Grady's position, abandoning any thought of self-preservation. The creature was faster, stronger, I knew that, but I pushed forward anyway, every step expecting the impact that never came. The forest swallowed my ragged breaths as I strained to hear pursuit. Nothing. When I reached him, Grady was still alive, barely. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven pulls. His eyes fluttered but didn't focus. Relief and terror tangled in my chest. My strength was fading fast. The belt tourniquet held, but blood loss left me lightheaded, the edges of my vision pulsing. I spotted Grady's bow beside him, 3 arrows still in the quiver. I slung it over my shoulder. Extra weight I could hardly afford, but maybe my only chance at a fight if it came to that. The woods were silent again, too still. I crouched, slid my arms beneath Grady's shoulders, and began to drag him backward through the brush. My muscles screamed, each pull smearing dirt and blood behind us. Then I noticed the canister clipped to his belt, bear spray. I tore it free and shoved it into my pocket. 2, maybe 3 minutes passed before I saw it again. The creature stepped into view about 70 yards ahead, moving with deliberate, confident strides. No longer a watcher, but a predator closing in. I lowered Grady's upper body to the ground, yanked the bow from my shoulder, and notched an arrow. The draw burned like fire through my injured hand, the pain flaring under the strain of the string. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice raw and cracking. It didn't stop. The ache in my arm turned to a tremor, my back seizing as I held the draw. I released. The arrow hissed past its right shoulder, harmless. My gut clenched as the creature exploded forward, sprinting on 2 legs, impossibly fast. I yanked the bear spray from my pocket and fumbled it somewhat as it closed the distance. I tore the safety pin free with my teeth and unleashed the entire canister into its face from 10 yards away. It screamed, high, animal, anguished, and clamped both hands over its eyes, but the spray didn't stop its charge. It hit me like a freight train, driving the air from my lungs as we crashed into the forest floor. It thrashed, blind with pain and rage, swinging in wide, murderous arcs. I gasped for breath, groped for stones in the duff, and hurled them at the blurred shape. Each one landed with a dull, meaty crack that made it stagger. By the 3rd stone it faltered, then turned and stumbled into the trees, retreating in clumsy, furious strides. I didn't know how long the spray effect would hold, or how long Grady could continue holding on. But I kept moving. I hooked my arms beneath his shoulders and dragged him toward camp, every step a fight against the fog of blood loss. When the tents finally came into view, I almost wept. Thank God. The satellite phone had a signal. I thumbed it on with shaking hands and called emergency services. My voice came out raw and uneven. "My partner, he's having a heart attack. I've got a serious hand injury, lost a lot of blood already." Then, without thinking, I added, "There's something else dangerous out here with us." I stopped myself. The dispatcher asked me to repeat that, asked for details, but what could I say? That something wearing the shape of a man and an animal was hunting us through the trees? I swallowed hard. "Just, please, send help," I said, "as fast as you can. Coordinates are in the phone." I described the campsite location as best I could, then checked Grady again. He was still breathing, shallow and fading fast. The phone signal dropped. I tried to reconnect again and again, nothing. The adrenaline ebbed, replaced by exhaustion. The world tilted. I knew I had to stay awake, but the forest blurred, edges dimming. I looked around one last time for any sign of the creature. Nothing. Then everything went dark. The next time I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital bed. A monitor beeped steadily beside me, and nurses were checking my vitals. Nyasha was in the hospital room, her face a mix of anger, relief, and something I couldn't name. As soon as I could speak, I asked about Grady. The nurse told me he was stable, but only because EMS had reached us by life flight in time. A few minutes later, and he wouldn't have made it. Nyasha asked what the hell had happened, how I'd injured my hand, what went wrong out there. I told her as much as I could, except about the thing in the woods. I don't know why I kept that part to myself. Maybe I was afraid of sounding insane. Maybe I knew she'd never let me set foot in the wild again. Would I even dare to after what I had experienced? But after everything, the blood, the terror, the narrow scrape with death, I felt something I hadn't in years. Alive. I'd seen something that shouldn't exist, and I knew, no matter what anyone else believed, that I would never see the world the same way again.